Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle J. Russell, and I am a research microbiologist at the Western Center for Food Safety at UC Davis. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. This is my first time recording a solo Zoom call, so hopefully this all works smoothly. I'm going to talk about food safety of biological soil amendments in organic and conventional agriculture. And this talk leans heavily on recent research, collaborative research that addresses some of what Dave Ingram talked about in terms of generating data to inform policy related to the produce safety rule, and specifically the subpart F that covers soil amendments. So the main highlights of my talk, your take-home message, if you fall asleep for the rest of it or need to go do something else, is first of all, the untreated biological soil amendments of animal origin, or as we call them, BSAAO, are a potential source of zoonotic foodborne pathogens. And I'll explain what that means. E. coli, in our field trials, we have found that it dies off pretty quickly within 30 to 60 days after applying raw manure in conventional and organic soils, but there is a possibility it can regrow, especially following rainfall, and that can go out past the USDA National Organic Program's wait period standard of 90 or 120 days. So I'll show you some of that research. And then finally, root crops and vegetables growing close to the ground are at increased risk for transfer of E. coli from contaminated manure amended soil. And so these would be scenarios that are higher risk when considering use of these amendments. A little bit of background about the public health concern. I am here under the food safety group talking about this because in particular, untreated raw animal manure can pose significant microbial risks. And that can be from directly handling and applying it, but there can also be secondary issues such as storing manure near adjacent farms or applying it, having runoff, wind, or cross-contamination with equipment. So it's a sensitive product to have on the farm. What I mean by zoonotic pathogens, these are pathogens that go from animals to people. They can actually go the other direction too, but when we're talking food safety, we're really looking at mostly at bacteria that come from animals. And the biggies in produce food safety are E. coli 0157 and Salmonella in particular, which are shed in fecal material and often of ruminants and other animals. There are some others that are less common in the produce environment. Parasites are another risk factor, that another group of organisms that can be found in manures. You'll see that I didn't put viruses here, and that's because most of the viruses that are of food safety importance, especially in produce food safety, come from humans. And whereas these bacteria and a few parasites are mostly from animals. So you're not thinking about food workers, you're thinking about ultimately an animal source, including manure. The transmission cycle is, I don't want to point the finger at the cow, but the truth is that cattle are considered the primary reservoir of E. coli 0157. And I use this as an example because it has, although it's still relatively rare, it has had major impacts on our produce and beef economy, and huge efforts in the regulatory community to try to, and the industry to try to keep this bacteria out of our food supply. And in cattle, it doesn't make them sick. So you would be collecting their manure, and the cattle can look completely healthy. They can be on grass or they can be on grain. Either way, 0157 can be in these cattle, but it can vary with diet and seasons, but it's very unpredictable. And so in the end, you have to always think that a raw manure source, especially out of a ruminant, could contain a pathogen. In terms of have we actually seen outbreaks and recalls, we have. It's not a daily occurrence, certainly, and a lot of the produce outbreaks, it's not real clear the exact mechanism of how contamination happens, but for sure soil amendments are looked at during outbreaks. And there was a report in the literature about people getting infected from a manured garden. home garden, and I do a lot of outreach with home gardeners that don't understand that horse manure and other manures can carry pathogens. There was also a relatively large outbreak that got traced back to salads. And when they did the investigation, it looked like a contributing factor was broadcast spraying of manure at from an adjacent dairy that might have drifted over into the lettuce fields. And there has been a salmonella recall that where untreated chicken bones that were composted was suspected as a source. So this is a link to and just an aerial photo from that outbreak that did involve romaine lettuce, traced to California, Central California. And it shows that the leafy green fields are in proximity to dairies and cattle forage crops. And this has generated a lot of talk about good neighbors and how we're careful when growing produce to also be in communication with the neighboring ag operations so that risk factors aren't introduced accidentally. So what type of animal manures are used as soil amendments in crop production specifically? It's actually all over the board. I've seen everything from what you'd expect, poultry, cattle, small ruminants, but also exotics, elephants, camels, rabbits, llamas. If you go on Craigslist, you could see any of these. And I have horses, and I've certainly used horse manure before on around my non-edible landscape or composted it. So a couple of definitions that are important. And sometimes anything that's a pile of stacked manure is called compost, and it's not until it goes through a validated process of time and temperature. When we're talking about these BSAAOs, it's raw. It has not gone through a validated treatment or composting process. And just leaving it stacked for a year, it's still raw manure. Time alone is not enough to make compost. And that is a misunderstanding when we've done surveys with various farmers, especially smaller growers that might be making their own compost or getting manures from neighbors. Untreated manure slurries. Here in California, we have large dairies. In other parts of the country, large swine operations where the manure, the liquid goes into a lagoon. There's also compost teas that might be made with raw manure. Those can be very risky because they're sprayed right on the plant leaves. And anything that's mixed with raw manure, if it's green waste mixed with raw manure, it's still raw manure and falls under the produce safety rule as Dr. Ingram probably talked about. I will point out also there's some non-manure based animal origin soil amendments that are considered safe to use because they've gone through a validated treatment process, but we still worry sometimes about them getting cross-contaminated. And one in particular at the bottom there, heat-treated poultry pellets. We are doing some research on those because they seem to attract crows and other animals, and we don't quite know what might be going on, but you have to still consider all of your sources of soil amendments, even if they have gone through a treatment. But from this point forward, I'm going to just talk about raw manure and some of the research we've done, especially related to produce food safety. To begin with, we have done some surveys with FDA, with CIFSAN group, and for risk assessments on different types of manures. We've looked at foodborne pathogens, the E. coli and the salmonella in cattle and poultry manure, respectively. And this is a picture of a windrow composting operation where they're bringing in feedlot manure. And these are large scale operations. This is a dairy in California where the lagoon goes into a pond, the liquids go into the lagoon, and then these dairy solids get stacked up, and then they can be brought out and put into windrows and also composted. But we do find that these have pathogens before they've gone through that proper composting process. But the large farms are not the only ones where we find pathogens. Here's a couple pictures. I had a study on smaller farms and medium-sized farms, and it was very common that they would be diversified and have animal, and they'd also have crops, vegetables, roadside stands, go to the farmer's market, maybe sell to local restaurants. And so you might go to those farms and they would have stacked manures there and composting, but we did find pathogens. They were not limited to the large dairies and feedlots and poultry operations at all. So it's a universal issue to consider. And then just one other, as far as it goes with different production practices, there's one that falls in between that we're doing some new exciting research on. Maybe we'll be back sometime. My colleague Alda Perez has been leading quite a bit of this, and it's looking at rotational grazing. And it's interesting because is it an animal intrusion? Is it application of raw manure? Is it both? Basically, they are fertilizing, during either in orchards or in a fallow or stubble field, crop field. They'll utilize sheep or other animals to graze, and then on cover crop, especially, and then rotate them off and plant their crops. We did do a preliminary study looking at E. coli die-off in an operation here in California, and I have the reference here in the slides, so if you want to read more about that. Some of our research has actually looked at who's using raw manure. It's not used a lot out here in California because of the leafy green marketing agreement and other buyer requirements that basically ban use of animal manures. But in some parts of the country, it is important, and especially to improve soil fertility and quality, and also to help manage manure in a region. And I'm sure there's a lot more about that at this conference, and so I'm kind of the one bringing the bad news, talking about some of the problems that can occur, but hopefully solutions too. We do have a paper that came out assessing who's using raw manure, specifically in the organic world, and have found that there are quite a few crops where raw manure is used around the country on produce for human consumption that might be eaten raw. So it falls under the produce safety rule, such as apples, lettuce, spinach, and so on. Our survey confirmed what we already knew from the organic community, is that, soil health, nutrient management, soil tilth cost, and waste management are all top reasons that raw manure is used. The sources, poultry and cattle led, but quite a bit of horse manure and as well as small ruminant manure being used. The big research question has been about these intervals. So the USDA National Organic Program, which is a marketing program, not a food safety program, but they do have in their standards a wait period from the time of putting untreated manure down to the time of harvesting. And if the crop touches the ground, you have to wait 120 days. If the crop is raised like tomatoes on a stake, then it's a 90-day wait period. But this wait period really had not been validated, and it is used in conventional too, in terms of the good agriculture practices. So it's been a guide for farmers using these manures. And so we were funded to do research and look at whether or not these application intervals are really appropriate when thinking specifically about food safety. And one of the early collaborations did include Manan Sharma, who I believe is another speaker today. And we had a multi-regional study going on from the East Coast over here to the West Coast. And this was an early study, but we pretty much stayed with the same design in all locations, and a little with a few tweaks for regional differences. But basically, we're using these non-pathogenic indicator E. coli strains that we mix with manure, and we simulate a commercial field. And we've done tomatoes, spinach, lettuce, quite a number of different trials over the years. This first one was all the way back in 2014. And it was interesting. We found with these, we used horse, steer, goat, and chicken litter, as well as controls. And we found this steady die-off the first 30 to 60 days. But then we had an interesting finding with a rain event, heavy rains, partway into this study, and of soil only, and had what we think was regrowth in this peak. And it did occur after the 120-day cutoff range. So this was just in soil. And, so we saw this nice log reduction in the beginning, and then this possible rebound with rain. And we didn't see a lot of differences between the manure types, longer survival, at higher levels in the poultry manure. Uh, Another study to look for, and right now the International Association for Food Protection is going on the same week. And we have 4 different abstracts on this very large study. It's in its last year, funded by the Organic Ag Research and Extension Initiative. Alda Perez is the lead PI. I'm a co-PI. We've got PIs in Maine and at USDA ARS and in Minnesota, working also with the Produce Safety Alliance. So it's both outreach and research, and we've done quite a few field trials. And this is a poster that we have on Wednesday this week, also virtually, with some preliminary findings from my group on the field trials, where we looked at root crops and being carrots as well as spinach that was close to the ground and growing during our more fall winter season. And we did at a certified organic farm on campus. And we did find that we saw transfer, especially under rainy conditions, more than 120 days out. So for those particular crops, there is some concern, and we're right now analyzing regional data, trying to see whether we need a metric that is a number like that, or if there is something more nuanced to address the food safety concerns related to using raw manure, especially in these crops that have been more vulnerable to contamination with E. coli, pathogenic E. coli strains, and strains that come from animal manure in particular. So that's all that I have today. Thank you very much. And I'll be joining the Q&A to answer any questions. And I thank my lab and all of the collaborators for their help with this.